Remember Flash, that free browser plugin? In November 1996, Macromedia unleashed it upon the world. Then Adobe acquired it, keeping the thing alive with critical patch after critical patch. In November 2011, after Apple refused to allow Flash on iOS, Adobe announced the end of support for mobile. Yet it wasn't until January 2021 that Flash officially died on the desktop. So maybe now when you hear the phrase gone in a flash, it might not actually be referring to how your system was compromised. Which means this week we talk with Ryan Lloyd from GuardSquare about the interesting threats that mobile apps face and how to harden those apps against modern attacks. In the news segment, chaos around a disclosure, details for Chaos DB, BusyBox vulns from fuzzing, new attacks from HTML smuggling, and more. Don't mention Silverlight, and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Contrast Security enables organizations to secure their applications from development to production. By embedding security sensors within software, Contrast automatically and continuously detects vulnerabilities in both custom and open source code while developers write code, providing them with context-specific how-to-fix guidance for easy and fast remediation. At the same time, by identifying only true vulnerabilities that pose risk and eliminating those that do not, Contrast empowers developers and security teams to prioritize and focus on only those vulnerabilities that matter. Learn how Contrast can help you secure your applications from development through production at securityweekly.com/contrast. Looking to improve your web application security? Probly is reinventing web application security. Probly focuses on the vulnerabilities that matter, eliminates false positives with evidence-based scanning, and provides a simple point-and-shoot solution that is easy to use. Probly's thorough coverage ensures accurate identification of vulnerabilities in any modern web application or API. Improve your web application security processes by visiting securityweekly.com/Probly and start your free trial today.
This is episode 174, recorded November 15th, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella, a man who, instead of running a free browser plugins, runs a browser free of plugins. At least I hope so, John.
It's pretty, well, it depends on which browser. One of them is pretty free. The other has a lot of them.
All right, well, we'll keep our fingers crossed, and maybe we'll have a survey at the end to see which one he's talking about. In the meantime, please join us live, or plan to join us for our next live webcast on December 2nd to see what's under the XDR hood. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to save your seat. And don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Ryan leads the product team at GuardSquare. In his role, he is responsible for overseeing the product vision and strategy. Prior to joining GuardSquare, Ryan held product management leadership roles at several developer-focused technology companies, including Veracode, SmartBear, and PTC. Hello, Ryan, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Mike. Great to see you.
It's wonderful to have you here, and also particularly happy because we often think of AppSec and go into the web application security route, which might also hit some APIs, which mobile applications clearly also have some web-based APIs on their back end. But mobile is pretty interesting. Mobile has some unique aspects to it. And one of the things I'd love to just kick off is talk about, what are some of those threats, or why should we be calling out or thinking about mobile application security, differently from web application security in terms of building those threat models and worrying about what types of attacks might be coming down the road.
Yeah. So, even in my experience, I was focused on security initially from a web app perspective, but when I joined GuardSquare, it was really interesting because you realize that things look a little bit different from the lens of mobile. And one of the key differences in the mobile app security space is that we're not just focused on the man-at-the-middle attack or server-side vulnerabilities. We have an application that's distributed through an app store and downloaded on end devices. And so what people can do when they're at the end with the device, with time and resources, available to them, I mean, it's pretty endless. They've got endless tools available and at their disposal to reverse engineer, manipulate the applications on the mobile device for a whole variety of reasons. Different industries see different manifestations of those threats, whether it's banking, gaming, consumer tech. I mean, it seems like in the last 18 plus months, everything's gone mobile. And that's actually what really inspired me to get into the mobile AppSec space. Was just, we're at this tipping point, I think, where mobiles no longer can be overlooked because of some of those security threats.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that stands out to me is that, of course, we could maybe talk about APIs and hopefully not talk about SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and those API backends. But the mobile aspect itself, a lot of the real-world threats and scenarios, some of which you're starting to allude to when you're ticking off different industries, those vulnerabilities tend to start to crop up in the business workflows. Call it that business logic, to recall whichever version of the OWASP top 10 that was in. And you mentioned things like consumer tech, purchasing tickets, right, for concerts, or even gaming. Lots of gaming. I think we've covered this a little bit on this past shows, just around anti-cheating mechanisms, because like many companies want to have good experiences for their players and tamp down on cheating. So I'm curious, are there help us fill out some of these threats and what they look like, perhaps in these various industries, and what some of the things we'd have to, for an application security team, start to keep in mind or make sure we keep in mind within our threat models.
Yeah, so I think historically, banking, financial services, payment systems has been the primary focus of mobile application security, because I think the threat was obvious to everyone. It's payment data, it's exploiting users in an app. So that's all, I guess, obvious to everyone. But now we're getting to the second and third wave of app developers that are realizing that there's material threats that impact them. So let's take gaming. Gaming is a great example, because you think about the incentives of someone who might want to attack a game. It's the gamers themselves. So it's not some mysterious sort of agent actor who's trying to attack the service. It's the gamer that you would normally sell to. So it's actually kind of hard to discern the threat actor from a legitimate user. And so in gaming, the goal there is, let's decompile this app, let's figure out how it works, and then let's manipulate it. That could be to bypass advertising in the game. It could be to acquire additional resources, whether it's coins or however the mechanics of that game work. So gaming, those are some examples, and that impacts the app developer in a really material way, because as soon as one person modifies or manipulates that game, they'll publish that online for thousands of others to consume. And it really erodes the trust in the game. In a multiplayer game, it means it's no longer fun, it's not competitive. Or in a game that's just more of a single user game, it can bypass the whole monetization strategy of that game and impact the developer. You mentioned ticketing. Ticketing is another great example. People using their understanding of your mobile application by reverse engineering it, by hooking it, running it on a jailbroken device to figure out the inner workings of it, so you can scale up the consumption and purchase of limited tickets or events or things of that nature. And then maybe the last example I'll touch on is consumer tech, because it's got a bit of a different flavor to it. We're seeing in today's sort of world of media hype and scrutiny, there's a lot of demand for leaking announcements and features that are coming in the mainstream consumer tech that we see in our lives all the time. So you'll see a lot of folks targeting these mobile apps of these big consumer brands just to understand what their roadmap is, what's coming, how to leak those features and announcements that have started to make their way into the applications, because they have maybe a 6-month or 9-month lead time to develop.
Yeah, and those I like those examples because they bring up new and different, at least types of attack scenarios that I think don't get discussed too often, especially if we're just looking at technical top 10 lists. Because you're describing more of not quite reputational risks necessarily of someone going in and reverse engineering particular new features coming out, but it means that the companies are losing control of a narrative around new features, and that can have consequences, financial consequences for them, as well as marketing. And so that's why I like these different creative ways that we need to think about mobile apps. So, and now we've been focusing quite a bit already on just setting the case for what these attacks are, why we should be worried, but we should start doing something about it. Now, obviously, I've been mentioning threat modeling more than once so far, but if we get beyond threat modeling and start to say, what should we do to harden our code? Or what are some of the things what are those conversations now that the application security team should be having with DevOps to say, how confident are we in the security of our mobile app? Or, do we have a smiley face or a sad face when we're releasing it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think starting with the threat model is a smart way to go, because the more you understand the threat, the better you can think about the systems, the controls that we're going to put in place to mitigate that. And teasing out some of these more nuanced examples of threat are pretty important. So from our perspective, there's the obvious code reviews you need to do on your application. That's going to help catch trivial errors like incorrect permissioning and things like that. Ideally, companies are going to start to automate the security testing for mobile. That's obviously quite mainstream on most development projects to do automated security testing. Mobile, however, has only recently started to have tool support that really is tailored to the unique aspects of a mobile application, because it does have a lot of differences from a web application, both in terms of the technology and coverage. So automating security testing is important. When we think about code hardening, we often kind of go hand in hand with obfuscation and encryption techniques at the code level. And this is really to help protect against some of the obvious static analysis techniques that are out there. So I talk about the consumer tech and leaking features. Code obfuscation can help protect the integrity of those features and keep them not so vulnerable to prying eyes, so to speak. Takes that low-hanging fruit off the table. And then you shift into maybe what kind of protections do we need to put in place around the app to kind of protect it from the environment it operates in. Because again, with the mobile apps, the unique aspect here is that you've got someone at the end with that device who controls the device it's running on. So it might be a rooted device, might be plugged into a debugger. They might be running the app. They might have extracted it from the app store, which is trivial to do, and running on an emulator. So having some protections in place in your app and around your app to identify the environment where it's operating is pretty crucial. Gaming is a great example of that. In gaming, you really want to be on the lookout for the environment it's being run in to detect when somebody might be trying to manipulate that game with things that are looking at the memory and so forth.
Yeah, I think this interesting about sort of that jailbroken aspect, because it's not like you can't control whether or not it's a jailbroken device, nor even necessarily can you trivially detect it in all cases. So I think what you're leading to there is those discussions around what should we use as a signal for this? So I think, as you were describing it, and maybe the question is, how have you seen different companies react to rooted devices, jailbroken devices, et cetera, in the sense of not allowing the app to run at all versus just using that as an input signal? Perhaps that's a signal for fraud, that if there is a rooted device or it's running in an emulator and it's collecting and it's trying to purchase a lot of tickets, that might be more evidence of bot activity rather than call it an authentic user. This idea of inauthentic, if I can speak today, behavior versus authentic behavior. So that's one aspect, but that also seems that's not something necessarily hardening code. That's actually writing new code to detect signals. So maybe if I do have a question in here somewhere, it's more around how have you seen developers approach the coding aspect, or maybe the detection of their environment around them, and using that as a source of signals for this is fraudulent. We should be more worried here, or for that matter, less worried here about the environment we're executing in.
Yeah, so there's almost there's a detection. There's what do you want to do about it, and how can that be leveraged elsewhere in your company, right? So the detection part, it's not trivial. It's hard. And it's constantly evolving as well. So the good news is there are lots of commercial products and vendors out there that provide libraries, toolkits, and protection software that can help detect those threats that are relevant. Emulators, rooted devices, jailbroken devices, specific game cheat software that might be running on the device. So you got to find maybe a trusted vendor and technologies to build upon. Some companies will try and invent and build that themselves, but it can be both costly up front and also it's hard to keep pace with how that landscape evolves so quickly.
That's like whack-a-mole. Yeah, exactly. I think I wanted to definitely riff on that keeping pace aspect, because one of the things you mentioned earlier was obfuscation. And now I know the obfuscation was the intention to protect confidentiality of upcoming features, things like that, not necessarily as a strict boundary for the integrity or the availability aspects of that CIA triad. And, whenever you mention obfuscation or obscurity, it's sort of the here be dragons in terms of, is this a good control, is security control or not? But what you're describing there, I think, is the better way to think of it, in the sense of it may be costly to implement anti-reverse engineering features, costly to implement, or you hope it's not too costly to implement obfuscation features, but there's a cost to your own developers, and ideally the cost to your attackers is that much higher. So, how do AppSec teams, DevOps teams try to think about or try to even measure about this difficulty, saying, here's the effort we're putting in to protect our app, and we hope, or do we have some better metrics or ideas around how much more difficult that's going to make it for attackers to actually do some reverse engineering or other types of analysis on our app?
Yeah. So, obfuscation, some teams will look at it and think it's a dirty word, and it's, security through obscurity. But, to me, it's a layer of defense, right? So you think about a defense in depth strategy, it's going to have layers to it. And this is one layer that can help, especially with the low hanging fruit, because the worst thing about mobile app security these days is that the bar just keeps getting lower and lower for people to perform static analysis techniques and dynamic analysis techniques. So it's a protective measure, part of a layer, and you've got to be careful though on how you approach the problem, because there are ways to simply obfuscate code, and the challenge there is if you're using something that's widely known and can be broken once, you can't rely on that any longer. So, when we think about implementing solutions for obfuscation and working with customers, it's all about two things. One, polymorphism in how we approach it, so that every release build of your application, the techniques and the way they're applied throughout your application look different. So that means even if someone spent enough time, enough resources to figure that out once, the next release you do, if you're on let's say releasing every couple of weeks, every 4 weeks, you're resetting the clock on them and just making it hard again. So if it takes them a lot of time to reverse engineer your application, and every time you release, you kind of reset that clock, that can be pretty discouraging. There will be other unprotected applications that people will go after first. So that's one way to look at it in terms of the role obfuscation plays.
Yeah, so definitely that idea of increasing that work factor and making, hopefully, that your attacker's work factor is higher than your own. I want to circle back to a little bit of, as we talk about hardening and on the defensive aspect of things, talked a little bit about APIs, and just with things like APIs in mind, or a lot of applications, mobile applications, may be built in code that has memory safety issues. So suddenly we do have to think about buffer overflows, heap overflows, things that aren't as traditionally common within web applications. So if you did have to go down a list of here's a couple common things to look for, separate from the obfuscation aspects, in just terms of code security, what might be a couple items on that short list that you'd want to make sure that your your developers are keeping in mind for their mobile side of things?
Yeah, I think the OWASP Mobile Top 10 provides a pretty good grounding on where to start and where to focus your efforts. You can always go deeper beyond that, but things like the security of communications between client and server, right? Making sure you're using good TLS and SSL between the mobile app and the server, SSL pinning where applicable, but all of those protection measures that you might put in place need to be complemented with other layers of security as well. Because looking at some examples from our security research team recently around SSL pinning, and some really public, visible examples of how to bypass SSL pinning in some of the most popular apps out there. So it's not just about using those secure communication mechanisms, but the part we touched on earlier about the runtime protections, the anti-tampering sort of preventative measures, is all about making sure that there isn't another way to get around those protective measures you put in place. So making sure you can't just take that communication when it's in memory, look at it, because sometimes even though the communication's secure, if you can intercept it at a point in time to just replay that mechanism, it doesn't matter how secure it is. So there's lots of examples here where it's just about putting the layered approach. So insecure communication, anti-tampering measures, obfuscation of sensitive and IP in your application, and then beyond that. Data storage on the app is a pervasive issue we continue to see, and hard-coded credentials. It's strange. You still see a lot of hard-coded keys and credentials that make their way into applications and aren't protected, which kind of weakens the whole system.
Yeah, that's the long sigh of, why do we still have these simple flaws, and why aren't our tools being better about throwing up the red squiggly line under our code, or at least setting off some other klaxons and alarms about these the programming basics, so to speak. One of the things that stood out to me too is that you're mentioning like hard-coded secrets, for example, and the idea of signed requests. I've seen, anecdotally, I've seen some mobile applications begin to sign requests between client and server. Obviously, on the client, it's possible to pull those secrets out, those signing keys, to a degree. So there's a work factor there. But the reason I bring that up is that we've also seen in things like Burp Suite, lots of AppSec pen testers are starting to create some helpful plugins to capture and re-sign those types of requests, just to make the pen testing a bit easier. Because, and I guess I'm using that as one of those examples of just showing how it is an increase in work factor on attackers, but I suppose we still want some friendly pen testing, if you will, or of course, just call it bug bounty testing of our applications. So how have you seen organizations approach that balance between either pen testing their own apps or doing their own reverse engineering to figure out, is this, are these hardening steps we're taking good investments, or how well are they working for us? Or are they maybe inhibiting the ability to find other more consequential vulns that, that we want the community that's going to go down the disclosure process to find for us?
Yeah. So, I think, there's no alternative to, implementing testing early in your process and making people accountable for thinking about security early on. But penetration testing is a great way to complement that, get an external point of view, validate your assumptions and design of your security, because it's easy to be too close to it sometimes during the development process. But beyond penetration testing, once your application's out there, it's in the real world, it's been downloaded in millions of devices, we're increasingly seeing a lot of value in more sort of monitoring your application in the wild. So we talked about sort of the benefits of runtime protection and sort of detecting these threats, jailbroken devices, rooted devices, and all these different signals. Bringing all those signals together and being able to identify when several of them are happening in concert can really give you a good indication of what the threat landscape looks like in the wild for your application, and where you might need to kind of course correct or adjust some of your security posture of your application. And you talked about sort of the fraud element to that as well, using those signals and those learnings to supplement even maybe some of your business fraud scenarios. We see it in finance, where they'll want to correlate that with other interesting signals and pieces of data for fraud detection. And we see it in gaming. If you see a concentration of users, of specific characteristics, performing a series of sort of threat items, like running the app on a jailbroken device and an emulator, and in succession, you can use that to inform how you ban users from using your game and kind of head off some of those anti-competitive cheats and modifications that go on.
Yeah, so there's sort of go ahead, John.
Right, I'm just thinking about that. It's your, how would I say? I think a lot of, security product consumers out there or operators are always sensitive to how many their agents or things like that they have to install to keep everything secure. And this could go both ways. It's not so much a anti-product, could be a pro-product thing. But how do you think what you're talking about, sort of what you've been talking through there the last few minutes with, how do you sense some of those things? It was making me think about APM, application monitoring. Do you see a parallel there, or do you think some of the security tools can actually provide some of that APM data, or am I sort of barking off on a wrong tree, or does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, we look at it. We see there's actually a lot of value in maybe integrating some of that security tooling with APM tools. So, in fact, you think about a mobile game. Nowhere in the mobile world are the stakes so high in terms of performance. So, you think about implementing security controls, security checks, obfuscation. These things we've been talking about. They all come with trade-offs, right? Everything in security comes with trade-offs. So we actually see a lot of value in using performance profiling in conjunction with these security controls to kind of get that balance right. What parts of an application and whatnot do we need to protect? What are the critical performance characteristics, and how do we apply these things in the right way? But on the monitoring side, yeah, there might be more leverage to be explored there as well.
Yeah, I think if I'm trying, while you two were talking, I'm trying to come up with a pithy way to summarize that aspect, but I'm going to have to be a little bit more verbose, surprise. But it sounds to me that there's a security aspect of the client, is that yes, there's some basic hygiene, we'll call it, just about hardening the mobile client, but it's still the client and it's under control of the attacker. But what you two have just been describing is that there's also mobile security in terms of the client's behavior and that behavioral analysis, or that call it the metadata around what it's doing, whether it's something as simple as coming from a single IP address. That's probably oversimplified in this day and age. But we've seen, if you've seen the news in the last couple of years and looking at mobile fraud, you've possibly seen pictures of walls of physical hardware, physical devices, physical handsets that are just farms and farms of doing this type of fraud. But it sounds to me that if those signals are coming from a group of IP addresses, or they're targeting groups of accounts, or they're following very common sequences of events, those are signals that are going to be detectable because that's how you have to use the mobile client. And it's not something necessarily that attackers, I think, can easily work around. So that sounds like a very rich area to consider in terms of mobile security that's actually off the device.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's many different reasons to look at it that way. In the simplest examples, you can think about behavior analysis and detecting bots and spoofing. The hardest part with those kind of approaches, though, is sometimes you scale up a particular modified application, and the illegitimate use of an application may look very similar to the legitimate use of an application.
Yes.
But there's good sophisticated techniques coming around app attestation and verifying the authenticity of clients. Yeah, it's all about many different layers and security controls that are available to us as mobile app developers and security practitioners. It's about enriching our view and understanding to pick the right ones that make the most sense for us.
Absolutely. I think one of the things I'm happy about is that I was able to use a mobile app to successfully purchase some tickets to see Kraftwerk in the future. So that's what I have to look forward to in a couple months. Ryan, in terms of where your mind is at, maybe a bit more along the lines of mobile security, what do you see in the next couple months as something for either teams to consider, think about adding to the part of their SDLC practices, or just something that you're excited about in terms of mobile security?
For me, there's two things that I'm really excited about. One is more mainstream concern and adoption of the fundamental sort of mobile security practices. I think there's still so much room and potential for us to get that right. But in parallel to that, I'm also intrigued by the advanced customers we have, the most sophisticated organizations that are not just looking at sort of the mainstream fundamental practices, but they're looking at some really complex, hard edge cases that will probably be the mainstream in the future. So for us, it's the duality of supporting the mainstream audience today with the basics of security testing, code hardening, runtime protection, threat monitoring, while also exploring some of those new, more under-researched areas that will be the future threat.
Very cool. Well, thank you for bringing those messages to our audience. And we'll definitely have to see what those perhaps underappreciated threats are in another couple months and find out what you've been seeing and what kind of advice you can bring to us. So thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Also want to thank John and thank everyone who is hanging out in Discord or listening to us live. And if you'd like to learn more about GuardSquare, visit securityweekly.com/GuardSquare. With that, we're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.
Is your mobile app really secure? New vulnerabilities pop up every day, and malicious actors look for easy targets on app marketplaces to exploit. Securing your app's valuable IP and data is critical. GuardSquare's security solutions are built for developers and protect your app at every stage in the development lifecycle. Multiple layers of protection prevent reverse engineering and automatically detect tampering, making your app a difficult target for attackers. Learn more at securityweekly.com/GuardSquare. Software supply chain attacks are continuing to expose vulnerabilities in organizations around the world. The time has come to focus your efforts on security for your software packages. Cloudsmith is the only cloud-native software package management solution for your enterprise. With Cloudsmith Continuous Packaging, you can securely deliver software across the globe and mitigate potential threats from entering your supply chain. With over 23+ formats supported, Cloudsmith is the solution that engineers choose to safely deliver all of their assets. Reduce unneeded downtime and deliver with confidence. Start securing your software supply chain today by visiting securityweekly.com/Cloudsmith.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. Keynotes from Alyssa Miller, John Strand, Leslie Carhart, Dave Kennedy, and Merrill Vernon. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to register now and check out our exciting lineup. Well, John, we also, I think, have an exciting lineup of news for the week. It was pretty eventful, and I have a couple quick ones that I just want to mention, then a couple of things that might be a deep dive. In terms on the side of quick ones to mention and move along from, Robinhood had a security breach and extortion attempt. I couldn't really find any interesting details about it, so I'm going to just pretend it was another security. No, this wasn't a security misconfiguration. It was a social engineering. But the problem was that they didn't have FIDO keys, or they didn't have a strong two-factor authentication that would have been more resistant to this type of social engineering. So that was the thing that I just wanted to highlight. organizations, go deploy your FIDO keys. And I'll give you the chance there as I catch a breath for our next article, John, if you've got something else you want as a public service announcement for Robinhood.
Yes. Don't let your CSRs, your customer service representatives, have the ability to allow someone to gain access to 5 million records. So the version of that I heard was that social eng that happened was through a CSR. And maybe I might be, I hope I'm wrong there, right? That should be hopefully someone social engineered, like a DBA or like some sort of administrator or someone, not like the dude answering the phone, person answering the phone saying, hey, can I help you with your Coinbase or your Robinhood? Why would a CSR have that type of access? And that's the part what sort of blew my mind on this. But and if anyone wants a good example of what you shouldn't have in your, I can't say shouldn't have. If you want to see an example of not the best way of doing a disclosure note, take a look at theirs. It's just like, it's so legalized. It's like the lawyer spent probably hours in a room on that one. But I mean, they were within their window. They hit the letter of the law. That's great. But it doesn't give you warm fuzzies. It's a little too sanitized, I think, for my own taste.
No, that makes sense. And I suppose now I also don't have additional details on the technical aspects of the app, but I know that, for example, hitting a CSR, and then CSRs by nature need to have access to be able to view individual users' records, whether they're doing some type of, support, as you can imagine within workflows are necessary. But to your point too, if this, if they could script something, an attacker, or they can have access to enumerate 5 million records through that customer support portal without even having to get to the database, that's also something that probably should have been part of your threat modeling and should have been part of your application hardening. So, in this day and age, everyone doesn't exactly need root. They don't necessarily need access to the database if there's a nice leaky API that can pull all those records out. So, yes, we'll keep an eye out and see if we can learn some more about it and have something additional to talk about. There is something we learned more about with Chaos DB, which I think will be fun. But before we get into that, I did want to, we'll see how brief or not this goes. There was quite a disclosure saga around a disclosure for Palo Alto Networks, their PAN-OS. And trying to make a long story short, a vendor that does red teaming had disclosed a buffer overflow to Palo Alto Networks, but the disclosure timeline just so happened to be that they discovered this overflow in November of 2020, so roughly a year ago, almost to the date, and didn't disclose it until September of this year, so a good 10 or so months later. And they took a lot of flack about what does this, how coordinated is a coordinated disclosure process if you're sitting on a vuln like this for so long. Unfortunately, there's at least I think a bit of complexity to this, because I was looking at some of these timelines, and the impacted version actually was released in October, or was the fixed version, let me rephrase that, was also released in October 2020. Now, this fix, though, in PAN-OS 8.1.17, just to try and use some numbers here to keep my mind straight as I try to describe this, it didn't know that the vuln was there, so it didn't know that it fixed the vuln. But like many lifetimes of vulnerabilities, they can ebb and flow as code changes, as small things get fixed, as bugs get fixed. But bugs might get fixed without understanding the full exploitation consequences or potential behind them. So I think a long story short, which will be my theme of the day, is that there was more, I think, an aspect here of a lot of weak patching processes, and as well as this red teaming vendor sitting on a vulnerability that, had it been known, could have accelerated some of these patch management cycles, and is the type of vuln that you can also simulate. You don't necessarily need to sit on these types of buffer overflows. in order to use them effectively in a goal-oriented type of red teaming exercise, which is designed to test an organization's detection and response mechanisms more than just their patching mechanisms and process, things like that. So that was a little bit of how I saw this particular saga. John, I'm not sure how much you were paying attention to this, or if there were other things that you saw differently through your lenses.
I think sorry, I keep getting sucked into one of our next stories. This one, I was listening, and I did see this last week. I think what really sort of a head scratcher for me for a while is it took me a while to understand why they hadn't let go of it. I guess I wasn't thinking in that particular mindset last week. But yeah, they didn't release it so they could use it to pop other customers, which is pretty not great. I think the takeaway for me now, with my brain more caffeinated probably, is if I was looking to gain a few exploits in my little quiver, I might take a stab at poking around this company and seeing if I can find myself an easy way in, because I bet that's not the only ODay that they have which they haven't disclosed. So hope they got them shields up. But yeah, it was interesting that it got patched on accident. But as you said, that can happen.
That can happen. Well, now that we have your caffeinated brain, Mr. Kinsella, perhaps let's talk about that Chaos DB. This is a vulnerability. We covered it initially back in episode 164 when it was first reported by this researchers who saw Azure's Cosmos DB and were able to say, oh, there's some Jupyter notebooks in here. We can do some technical magic with them and compromise them to get into basically arbitrary tenants that are using any tenants of the Cosmos DB. Now, at the time, unfortunately, back in 164, there were no technical details. But now, 10 episodes later, they have kindly released technical details in a great write-up that walks through roughly 6 steps of just what went wrong. And now I'm going to hopefully not steal your thunder about what you want to talk about, John. But to set things up here, what they saw was that if you ran code like the default Python 3 or some other code programming languages, within this Jupyter notebook, it dropped into this Cosmos user account, basically a non-privileged account. Sounds good. That's probably a good design and how things should be. What they discovered is that C# had some sharp edges, so to speak. When they executed some C# code, it was executed with root privileges, which is very strange and curious. Is this just something that's a misconfiguration, or what made C# special? But that's how that was their initial foothold, and a lot of things fell apart from there. So let me stop stealing your thunder as a storm is coming in to Mr. Kinsella. What stands out for you, or what would you like to take us on next in this journey to chaos?
This one's the post is great, man. Everyone go read this. I had seen it last week, but I didn't realize they got into juicy details until I was reading it this morning. And Johnny's probably been watching me on camera for the last hour, like mouth agape, like literally just like I'm shocked.
Couple things went wrong, huh?
So let's. I'm trying to. Leave our friends in Redmond out of this, but just the very first thing they have in here, that OS was obviously not hardened. If you look at like the first or second screenshot after they got root, they do the cat Etsy password, and like I was just looking through the list of accounts, like games, LP, no even whiff of hardening on this. Again, how if you can, we all have dirty laundry, right? It's even like the last the Robin Hood story you're talking about. I was going to say, you know how this happened, right? It's someone initially had some sort of an account, some sort of an API, which they're like, oh, we'll make sure we take care of that before it goes out to prod, and they didn't. So now there's an API out there where you're able to get all your accounts, or some CSR have more permissions than they should have. Or they meant to put like a RBAC control on it and they forgot, or they did, but they didn't set that happens. I get it. But you can only do that so many times. And that's what this post sort of shows. We talk a lot about pivot attacks, and all you need is, we use a phrase like, or I use that phrase like rock climbing. Like, I just need to get a finger hold or a toe hold in, and then I can use that to get further and further and further. This is a really great example of that. What you need to have hardening in depth. One of the first thoughts I had is, if I was running a cloud-based service as a provider, I would make sure root wasn't a root, or root didn't exist in that box. That's just, hardening, man. That's sort of, and that's not ASW, right? That's just pure OS hardening. Then from there on and on and on you go. I'm not sure what I can say here on an application security aspect, really. It's I'm actually at a loss for words. It's really incredible. We keep my editorializing to myself. I think it's so out there to me that, like, really just go and listen to any of our shows and you'll have a better background. Go listen to any of our shows and actually do some things we talk about. Like, just pick any of them, and you'll be in a better state than I think this was. This is very interesting, let's say. I'm actually at a loss for words, so I'm going to just stop stuttering.
No, I hear you on that one, because there is so cloud service providers should have the shared responsibility model. Started by AWS, and the other CSPs have adopted that concept, and you're supposed to be sharing responsibility, not sharing root access across your systems, which is what poor John is stumbling around here. Just how.
You're supposed to be good cop to my bad cop. You're not supposed to be egging me on here. It's funny, because that, I probably said it on this show to a degree at some point, that shared responsibility phrase I take as a bit of a cop out. And there's definitely a shared responsibility, but when that phrase started becoming popular in the last 2 years or so, I felt like it was, I think Amazon, you're right, started using it first. I got the sense that it was Amazon saying, hey, we're not going to secure all your stuff for you. You have to, put on your big boy pants.
Right.
Which is completely true. But I remember when that first came out, it felt a little bit like there was someone was taking a step back from what they probably could have been doing. But yeah, like you said, this is shared vulnerabilities. That's vulnerabilities in scale. I can go on all day. I'm mouth shut.
Yeah, no. So while we let some more of that caffeine kick in and let John's brain relax from this write-up, which is wonderful write-up, do read it. I guess some of the things I wanted to highlight from this is that if you look at what the researchers did, they basically did the living off the land in terms of poking around, pivoting, and expanding their access. Meaning, all they had to do the get root with running some arbitrary code within a Jupyter notebook. Those notebooks are designed to run arbitrary code. Just so happened that C# gave it that, I guess, there's that little sharp sign. It does not represent root. Maybe that was there's a joke in there somewhere. I'll have to work on that. Sorry. But I guess where I'm getting hit here too is your observability. One of the things that we talk about sometimes, but maybe not enough, is observability within your network, within your systems. And so you didn't need observability here to see who is running Netcat, who are running some of the obvious compromise, post-exploitation tools. Everything in here was, I think, cloud native, Azure services, Azure APIs, just being poked around with legit credentials and legit mutual certificates for authentication. So this is where you need that observability. A little bit of what we were talking about in the last segment with Ryan is, what is the activity that's going on, and is that activity suspect or suspicious or not, which is easier said than done. But if you have that capability, but if you don't have that capability, it's an area where you should probably be investing on to see, if you're flushing IP tables, that doesn't seem very common. Or if you're using your mutual TLS certificates for service-to-service authentication, that's also something that maybe you should revisit how your zero trust network is set up. And occasionally those network boundaries are in fact a good thing to have, and not just put purely onto device attestation, or for that matter, maybe increase that device attestation. So those are some of the areas I would try to pull out on the theme of application security. But at the risk of further breaking John, maybe let's go on to something also in the Unix world, but something a lot more self-contained within BusyBox. So BusyBox is a Unix. It can run on, I came across it first on Linux, but it can be ported to many things. And it's basically a suite of software tools for system administration that's very common within the IoT space because it's a small footprint. What was really neat in this article, some researchers said, we want to look for some vulns in BusyBox, and we're going to fuzz for it. So this, to my mind, was a great example of successful use of fuzzing that's identified a bunch of consequential or vulns that need to be fixed. So regardless of whether or not you're actually using BusyBox, I'm not going to be able to say, I keep thinking fuzzing. That's why I want to say BusyBox. BusyBox, that doesn't matter so much as the aspect of how mature is your environment or as mature is your SDLC process to be able to support an approach to fuzzing. And fuzzing is also something that could be definitely beneficial to the mobile environment as well. So also have a little bit of that tie into our last segment as well. So John, this is how I'm setting up your the throw over to you. Let's see if your brain has rebooted and come out of that journey into chaos. So how are you doing over there?
I'm better. I actually there was another mouth agape after when you were talking. Thank God for mute. Yeah, that guys, you got to go read that one. That's a good one. It's that good on Wiz. So the fuzzer stuff. I'd for a long time heard mumblings that there were potential for juiciness in BusyBox. Never really, not recently, but I've heard people say it over the years. I personally really dislike BusyBox because it will, you think you're on a Unix shell and you try some of your commands and you realize something's not working. And you're like, wait, it's that. The Alpine guys liked it, so I've run into it a decent amount. This is great work. I mean, the fuzzing stuff in general, we've talked about it a bunch. I've done a decent amount of work with it myself. It's expensive to do because it's expensive to set up, it's expensive to run, it's expensive to find, expensive to fix. But in many cases like this, the results are really great. And like we know, Google, we're going to talk more about Google coming up, but they've had their fuzzing service for open source stuff. It's one of those areas that, as much as I suspect a lot of people, particularly probably management, really eye roll when you talk about fuzzing, a lot of really great stuff comes out of it to prevent some of the other things we've talked about in other stories today. So yeah, no, nothing particular. I haven't looked into any of the actual issues which they found, but they found quite a few of them. It's some nice work.
It's definitely some nice work, and so it's great to see that the work from these researchers, as you mentioned, work from Wiz about the Chaos DB. So these are a general editorial announcement to our readers out there. If you come across these types of write-ups, or if you are the researchers creating them, make sure to drop them into our Discord because we'd love to highlight more great write-ups like this. And John, you set up a great segue. Thank you, mentioning Google, which we mention Google quite a bit, I realize, on the show, but I think it's well deserved in this case because they were announcing this Cluster Fuzz Lite, which is basically a way to bring some fuzzing capabilities into the SDLC because, John, as you noted, fuzzing is easy to say, but it can be a lot harder to implement. And as I was writing up in the show notes, you definitely do need an aspect of maturity, an elevated maturity in your SDLC practices before you should dive into fuzzing. It's the type of thing that if you've just built an app and you have, you're just standing up an application security program, you don't start with an OWASP top 10 as your foundation. And you don't start with a bug bounty as your first AppSec approach. And you don't start with fuzzing because you're just going to confuse and take up all the time of your developers when they could be doing some of the better basics. But with that said, this work from Google is one of the ways to help with those better basics so that this fuzzing can then identify vulns or identify bugs. And sometimes those bugs are vulns that can be exploitable. Sometimes they're just bugs that should be fixed because they cause a crash, and that leads to software quality. So some good things to think about with fuzzing. And like the FIDO keys, I guess this episode brought to you with the word by the letter F, which we're not going to go back to the Chaos DB because I know what John's opinion of the letter F is going to be on that one. But fuzzing here is pretty good, and that's the best I can squeeze out of these two articles.
On your comment about when to use fuzz, or you need a little more maturity, the thought I had there for folks who haven't done this or might wonder why we sort of we consider it such an advanced thing. Really, what you're doing is like you're covering your eyes and like feeling around in the dark, and you might get something, you might not. But if it's not set up right, or if you're a beginner doing it, you're not even sure to use your finger or a fist, right? You're really just poking around. So that's why it's sort of considered like that. I think what's interesting about Cluster Fuzz Lite is they're providing with the plugins for GitHub Actions and things like that. So that sounds, I think to a lot of us, it sounds very simple. It's like, oh, you just gave me a script so I can run my CI. But at the same time, that if one less thing to do, if I can just go and, add an action, hell, let's do it and just see what happens. I would, I've done that with multiple other security products in the last few months. I'm like, hey, let me just create a branch and like throw an action on there. And if the action's there, let's just see what happens. What do I get out of it? So it becomes quite, I'll say quite affordable. But at the same time, the script for the action is free, but if that action is going to run somewhere, you're still going to pay for those cycles. So it's right. There's still a cost associated with it. But this is it's interesting, right? We talked with FuzzBuzz in the past. I was using the Wild previous company. There's lots of folks out there trying to make, not lots, but there's a good number of folks out there trying to make this as easy as possible, but it's still a fairly advanced thing. So any ease of use is definitely appreciated.
+1 for the ease of use. And I threw another article in here that didn't have anything timely in terms of updates or blog posts or news, but I thought it was topical in terms of talking about fuzzing and alternatives to setting up fuzzing. So this is Prosimo article I'm talking about, a project that's looking to basically rustify a bunch of consequential software applications out there. And they're the project behind putting Rust into the Linux kernel. So we're talking about the device drivers, which we talked about. I can't remember the episode, but we talked about it somewhere. We'll find out which episode that was. But they're also looking at curl, mod TLS, and NTP is the latest one that they're trying to get some funding and support for. And focusing this not so much on the idea that it's specifically Rust that's trying to be, that is a more memory safe language, but more about look at the attack surface they're tackling. Very common things like the Linux kernel. Curl, very common tool. Mod TLS, pretty pervasive. NTP, again, a very ubiquitous type of tool out there. So as we talk about maturing your SDLC and where what's the path your developers and your DevOps team wants to go, maybe they could go down the fuzzing route, but maybe, and this is why I also wanted to pull this in here, maybe we could refactor our code into something new and change it from C into Rust or Go for that matter. And I'm always a fan of refactoring, but it's once again, it's an investment to make, and that investment has to be made with your eyes open and understanding here's the engineering and money essentially that you're sinking into this type of approach. So that was why I pulled in this particular article about Prosimo and rust-proofing the internet.
I was just digging through who's funding this. The usual folks, because this is, while they're looking for help to do this work, this is it's one of those things which the result is good. It's not quite as fuzzy as fuzzing itself, but you're welcome. Still, it's important, but it's you're not just going to go and start rewriting stuff unless you got a really good reason. So thank you, Mozilla, EFF, Amazon, Bill and Melinda Gates. That's an interesting one. Facebook, OVH Cloud. I haven't heard about them for a while. So all those guys, thanks for helping fund this type of thing. It's quite beneficial for all of us.
So one of the other things that could be beneficial is looking at more C-based stacks. In this case, there was another article about Nucleus real-time operating system and the TCP/IP stack in it. And this one, again, it stood out to me as just one of those things that would be rife for fuzzing, although I don't think these researchers actually used fuzzing to find the dozen or so vulns in it. But one of the things that stood out was just how simple, like TFTP, FTP server, there's a simple stack-based overflow, so there's a lack of ASLR, I guess. So these are some things that just stood out of why do we have this type of software in this day and age? So let's fuzz more. So that's, I guess, what I wanted to hit on that one.
I wonder if you could set up a Jupyter notebook and use that to fuzz like a cloud provider. Wait, sorry. This, it's so first, excuse my outburst. The power is like right on the edge going out here and lights were flickering and I thought I was done, but lights are still on. Knock on wood. As I giggled, as soon as you say like, we're on a security show, as soon as you say TCP/IP stack, I'm like, oh, I know where this is going.
Yeah, exactly.
It's, again, glad they're doing it, now rather than never. Wow, they got a 9.8 in there. FTP user does not properly validate length of user command. Yeah, I didn't look at this article before, but it's the standard, and these things are super important. We're usually at RTO. I mean, oh god, these RTOSs are super important, and my exclamation there was realizing that this particular RTOS runs on medical equipment. What's a teachable story here? It's how sorry, we've seen after the what was the nuclear centrifuge, I can't remember that big long, that was Siemens equipment too, I can't remember the name of that hack, but we know that these OSs, which are super critical, running on critical software, should be using something which has been very carefully looked at. So I'm a little surprised this is going on with Siemens. But it's probably, no, it's not cheaper equipment. It's life or death. So again, yeah, I'm glad to see that these were discovered. How about, I'll leave it at that. There's good learning things in here for people. I think the fun thing is maybe, are any of the RTOSs open source? I think there's one free RTOS. I think it is. It'd be fun for folks to go and look at those and get a sense for, because this and BusyBox both have that same, I'll say, mission of being very efficient with very little. They're not going to implement the full Unix or the full OS or full whatever else, but still, what they do, they have to do very, very well and very securely. So it's probably some good educational material from the point of view of you're not dealing with the whole Linux kernel with the device drivers for how many hundreds of thousands of things. You should be able to go through and see the OS a little bit quicker and understand what's going on. But that means also you should be able to point out or notice bugs a little bit easier, maybe, possibly. I don't know. I'm not saying that to shame these guys. I'm saying that as just an education experience for somebody who was bored on the weekend.
No, I think I agree. I think especially if there's something as simple as these TFTP, FTP services, basically the other thing, non-encrypted services, these can also be easier ways just to do some simpler research because you're not having to jump over hurdles of either decrypting traffic, although that wasn't necessarily in any case for this, or having to work around things like ASLR or other stack hardening countermeasures. So it can also just be a little bit more fruitful, perhaps, to use another F word. Of the day as an educational. So that's a great angle. And before the power goes out, John, we had HTTP smuggling for the last 2 years. We now have HTML smuggling, which is pretty cool. So it's nice to see some creative uses of HTML5, which HTML smuggling in a nutshell is basically using the JavaScript blob object to create an octet stream, which is I'm trying not to just say a stream of octets, but is basically a blob of bytes that can represent a binary. And so they combined this JavaScript blob of inscrutable bytes and with the download attribute that was introduced in HTML5 to essentially create a way to bypass sort of different areas of security scrutiny, different security boundaries within organizations, where that might be doing things like having a proxy that examines content, having an email proxy that examines content, looking for things like malicious software, PDFs. No longer have Flash attachments, thankfully, but there's plenty of other, as I mentioned, PDFs, plenty of other venues into a browser. And this is just pretty clever use of it. It's a fun way to just understand what are some nuances of HTML5. I don't know how pervasive it is, but Microsoft did a nice write-up for it. They've seen it in the real world, and so it's something to be worried about.
Mike, why are you worried about a browser? I mean, you're going to have JavaScript and Excel next year, so I mean, you'll be able to do this right there. Yeah, sorry. This one this is
that's so called a callback, folks. Well done.
Yes. It is yeah, the filtering, someone commented on Discord. Yeah, when's my filter gonna break? It's neat. Leave the logo off the top of the page and the snarky comments aside. I mean, all this stuff, man, it's interesting the amount of really crazy things like this you can do with JavaScript, or let's be honest, whatever language you put into a browser. Well, I'd like to think that a more sophisticated language like wouldn't have these issues, but still, it's a complex language that's been made easy so that people can easily develop for the web. I mean, that's really what this is. So it's always going to have all sorts of stuff like this going on, unfortunately. But yeah, sorry, something stuck out at me on the page. It's good to think about. I mean, at the same time, do I want people to go and study this to learn? Or I'm going with this, I'm switching my attitude from the last two stories where I'm saying, hey, this is something you can learn from and do that type of thing. And here I'm trying to go towards the opposite and say, yeah, I think the longer you look at JavaScript, the more issues you go see with it. And as we have more stuff coming out, we're going to see, more craziness. But at the same time, from a defensive application point of view, I think, I don't know. I'm curious your thoughts on this, but the statement I'll put out there is I think you've not gone too far, but we're passing teachable. We're repeating ourselves with this. It's like, okay, beside the fact don't use JavaScript, but just what could go wrong? It's JavaScript and Excel, someone in Discord. But the point being is, okay, is there something you can take away from this particular story and abstract that a little bit and use that in other languages or in the day-to-day what you're doing with application security in your organization? That's the part. Do you see something there for it? I mean, I guess sort of, okay, it's an octet stream. How you decode that's always going to be a bit of a dicey issue. But the rest of the dressing around the JavaScript and all that type of thing can be overlooked, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I makes sense to me, and I see where you're going. I think to me, one of the things that stood out is, I opened up the show talking about Flash, and one of the reasons Flash was replaced on mobile was the emergence of HTML5, and HTML5 had the native video player, had a lot of functionality that could replace something like Flash for many good reasons, one of which it lives within the same origin policy. So this article with HTML smuggling seems more like a failure to consider, or maybe, I'll stick with failure. This episode brought to you by the letter F. A failure in thinking through all of the security boundaries and how the existing capabilities that are not being abused or misused. This is just a